The chains hit the sheriff's desk with a sound like a death knell. Catherine Hayes stood in the doorway of the Redemption, Texas jailhouse, her wrists bound in iron, her dark hair wild from 3 days of hard riding across open desert, her green eyes burning with a fury so bright it could have set the whole town ablaze. The man who had dragged her across 200 miles of scorched earth and rattlesnake country stood behind her with one hand wrapped around the chain like he owned her, like she was livestock he'd finally managed to pen. His name was Deke Hollis, and he smelled like whiskey and self-satisfaction, which in Catherine's experience were usually the same thing. "Sheriff Donnelly," Hollis said, dropping into the chair across from the desk without being invited, the way men with guns and no manners always did. "Got your woman, Catherine Hayes, wanted in connection with the robbery of the Abilene Trust and Savings, theft of federal currency, and the murder of one Randolph Hayes." The word murder dropped into the room like a stone into still water. And Isaac Donnelly, sheriff of Redemption County, looked up from the papers he had been signing, and everything inside Catherine's chest went absolutely still. He was not what she had expected. The bounty hunters who had been chasing her for 6 weeks had described the sheriff of this particular corner of West Texas as a hard man, a former army man, a man who ate criminals for breakfast and slept like a baby afterward. What she had not expected was the quiet in his eyes. Dark brown, almost black in the low lamplight of the jailhouse, steady as bedrock, and completely unreadable in a way that made Catherine's breath catch against her will. He looked at the chains on her wrists. He looked at Deke Hollis sprawled in his chair. He looked at Catherine. Something moved behind those dark eyes, something careful and measuring, and she could have sworn briefly angry. "Set the paperwork on the desk," he said to Hollis. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that never needed to be raised because everything in the room simply rearranged itself around it. Hollis grinned and slapped a folded document down. $500, Donnelly, that's what she's worth. I expect payment within the week." Isaac Donnelly picked up the document, read it for what felt like a very long time, and then set it back down. "Get out," he said. Hollis blinked. "Beg your pardon. Get out of my office, Hollis. Get your horse, get your gear, and get out of Redemption. If you're still within the county limits by sundown, I will arrest you for the outstanding warrant on your name from the Bexar County Court." The silence that followed was so complete that Catherine could hear the wind moving through the gap under the door, could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Deke Hollis's shock hardening into something uglier. "You can't do that," Hollis said, very slowly. "I brought her in. I'm owed." "You're owed nothing from this office," Isaac said, and there was something beneath the calm now, something iron-forged and immovable. "I know who you are and I know how you operate, and I will not be handing a living woman over to a man who has filed 3 bounty claims in the past year where the subject was already dead before they arrived. Get out of my county." She had not expected to be saved. That was the thing about being in chains for 3 days. You stopped expecting anything good. Deke Hollis stood up slowly, his jaw tight, his hand drifting toward his holster in that deliberate way men did when they wanted you to notice that they had a gun and were considering using it. Isaac Donnelly did not reach for his own weapon. He simply looked at Hollis the way a mountain looks at weather. Hollis left. The door banged shut behind him, and Catherine Hayes, who had not cried once in 6 weeks of being hunted across half of Texas, felt something dangerous and unfamiliar rise behind her eyes that she absolutely refused to name. Now, she needed to survive. 6 weeks earlier, Catherine Hayes had been a wife. She had married Randolph Hayes 3 years ago in Kansas City, when she was 22 and he was 31. And she had believed with the full and genuine conviction of a woman who wanted desperately to believe in something that he was a man of industry and promise. He had told her he was an investor. He had told her they would build something real. He had given her a house with a wraparound porch and a garden where she grew tomatoes and herbs and tried to convince herself that this was enough, that this was the life she had chosen, that the quiet dissatisfaction she felt in her bones was just a character flaw she needed to work on. She had been wrong about all of it. Randolph Hayes was not an investor. He was a thief, a con man, and a liar with extraordinary social graces, and a talent for making himself look like exactly what people needed him to be. He had embezzled from 3 separate businesses in Kansas City, borrowed heavily from men who collected their debts with violence, and for the past 18 months had been systematically looting the Abilene Trust and Savings through a series of fraudulent land transactions that Catherine had known absolutely nothing about. She had found out the night he died. She had come home to find the house in disarray, papers everywhere, the lockbox they kept under the floorboards of the bedroom pried open and empty. Randolph had been in the study, drunk and sweating and talking very fast about how they needed to leave, how they needed to go right now, how there were men coming who would not be kind about what was owed to them. "What did you do?" she had asked him. She remembered her own voice, very calm, the way she went calm when she was most frightened. He had told her, some of it, enough. And then the men he owed had arrived before he finished telling her. And there had been a confrontation in the front hallway of the house with the wraparound porch. And Randolph Hayes had pulled a gun that Catherine had not known he owned, and someone had shot first. And when it was over, Randolph was dead on the floor, and the men who had come for him were gone, and Catherine was standing alone in her own hallway with her husband's blood on her dress, and $3,000 in federal currency scattered across the floor, which had apparently been in the lockbox all along, which Randolph must have failed to mention. She had not killed him. She had loved him once, in the diminished and exhausted way of a woman who had been disappointed too many times to fully love anyone anymore. But she had not killed him, and she had not stolen anything, and none of that had mattered even slightly when the sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later because someone in the neighborhood had heard the shot. She had run. She was not proud of it, but she had been 24 years old and alone and covered in blood, and holding $3,000 that she had not known how to explain. And so she had run, and that had made her look guilty of everything she was innocent of, and also some things she had genuinely done, specifically the running and the taking of the money which she had needed because she had nothing else. 6 weeks later, Deke Hollis had caught up with her in a small town 40 miles north of Redemption, and the story that had emerged from the dispatches and wanted posters and the self-serving testimony of Randolph's business associates had turned her into a murderess and a bank robber, and she had been brought in chains to a jailhouse in Redemption, Texas in the spring of 1878, and a sheriff with quiet dark eyes had sent the bounty hunter away. Isaac Donnelly unlocked her chains himself. He did not make a production of it. He simply produced a key from his desk drawer, crossed the room, and crouched slightly to work the lock on the wrist iron, and Catherine stood very still and watched the top of his head and told herself that whatever she was feeling was just the animal relief of having the metal removed from her skin. The chains fell away. She rubbed her wrists without thinking about it. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "There's water on the desk. You look like you've been riding in heat." 3 days without shade, she confirmed, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small victory. She sat in the chair Hollis had vacated and accepted the tin cup he pushed across the desk and drank, and the water was cool and tasted faintly of iron, and she had never been more grateful for anything in her life. He sat across from her and looked at the document Hollis had left. She looked at him. He was perhaps 30, she thought, broad through the shoulders, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate when they remembered to, a scar along his jaw that had healed clean. Dark hands, working hands, with a star on his chest that looked like it had been there a long time. "Catherine Hayes," he said, reading from the document. "That's my name. Wanted for the murder of Randolph Hayes." He paused. "Your husband, my late husband, and the robbery of the Abilene Trust and Savings." "I did not rob the Abilene Trust and Savings. My husband spent 3 years robbing the Abilene Trust and Savings, and I was apparently the last person in the state of Kansas to know about it." He looked up at that. Something shifted in his expression, not disbelief but a kind of careful attention, the look of a man who was genuinely listening rather than just waiting for her to stop talking. "And the murder?" he asked quietly. "He was killed by men he owed money to. I was standing in the hallway. I did not fire a weapon." She met his eyes without flinching. "I understand how it looks. I understand why it looks that way, but I am telling you the truth." A long silence. "Where did you get the $3,000? "It was in our lockbox. I didn't know it was there until that night. I took it because I had nothing else and I needed to survive." He nodded slowly. Not the nod of a man who was agreeing with her, but the nod of a man who was filing information away somewhere careful and precise. "I'm going to need you to stay in redemption for the time being," he said. Her stomach dropped. "You're keeping me here." "I'm keeping you safe," he said, and there was a distinction in the way he said it that she felt in her chest even though she wasn't sure she trusted it yet. "Deke Hollis is not the only person looking for you, and the men who killed your husband are still at large. If the robbery charges are connected to them, you're a witness whether you know it or not, and witnesses have a way of disappearing when the wrong people are looking for them." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not locking you up. I'm asking you to stay. There's a boarding house 2 streets over run by a woman named Martha Crane. It's decent and she doesn't ask too many questions. I'll cover the first week." Catherine stared at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that the question had landed somewhere real inside him. "Because you haven't been tried," he said finally. "And in this county that still means something." She stayed. She told herself it was because she had nowhere else to go, which was true. She told herself it was because she needed time to think, to figure out her next move, to write letters and gather evidence and find some way to prove what she knew in her bones was the real shape of the story. All of that was true. She did not tell herself the real reason, which was that for the first time in 6 weeks, in 3 years, in longer than she could clearly remember, she had felt for a single moment like she was not entirely alone. Martha Crane's boarding house was clean and smelled of beeswax and dried herbs, and Martha herself was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of about 50 who had survived 2 husbands, a smallpox outbreak, and the arrival of the railroad in redemption with equal equanimity. She took one look at Catherine's condition and drew a bath without being asked, and Catherine sat in hot water in a copper tub behind a cotton curtain and shook for about 10 minutes before she got herself back under control. The town of Redemption was larger than she had expected, a proper frontier town in 1878, with a post office, a general store, a church, a saloon, a livery stable, and about 400 residents in various states of permanence. It sat in a valley between 2 low ridge lines with the Pecos River visible in the distance on clear days, and the land around it was the particular spare beauty of West Texas, all ochre and sage and wide sky, the kind of landscape that either broke you or remade you depending on what you brought to it. Catherine spent her first 3 days in redemption in bed, sleeping in a way that felt more like falling than resting, eating the soup Martha brought her without tasting it, and gradually becoming aware that her body had been operating for 6 weeks on pure fear and adrenaline and now wanted to present her with the full accounting. On the 4th day, she got up, dressed, and went to find the sheriff. Isaac Donnelly was not in his office. The young deputy on duty, a freckled boy of about 20 named Paul, told her the sheriff was at the south end of town dealing with a dispute about water rights, which apparently consumed a significant portion of frontier law enforcement. Catherine walked south. She found him standing between 2 red-faced ranchers in the middle of a dry creek bed, and she watched him work for a while before he noticed her. He listened to both men with equal patience. He asked questions that were quiet and precise, and that somehow cut through the noise of both men's outrage to the actual shape of the problem underneath. He made a decision that was fair in a way that left both men slightly dissatisfied, but that Catherine, standing 20 yards away in the scrub grass, could see was genuinely equitable. After the ranchers had left, he walked over to where she was standing. "You look better," he said. "I feel human again," she said. Approximately, something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face. "Martha's soup. Is it always that effective? She nursed half the town through a fever 2 winters back. Whatever she puts in it works." They walked back toward town together, which was not something either of them had planned, but neither of them adjusted course. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the ridge lines, turning them deep gold and rust, and Catherine felt the land in a way she hadn't before, the bigness of it, the indifferent beauty of it. "I need to write letters," she said, "to Kansas City." There were people there, business associates of my husband's who I believe were the real architects of the robbery. One of them is a man named Victor Larn. He ran the land transaction side of the operation. Isaac was quiet for a moment. "You know that name from specific conversations you had with your husband?" "From documents I saw. The night he died, there were papers everywhere, and I read what I could before I ran. I don't have the papers anymore, but I have a good memory, and I can describe what they contained." He stopped walking and turned to look at her, and the seriousness in his expression was something she was beginning to recognize as simply how he engaged with things that mattered. He did not perform seriousness. He simply was serious, and there was an honesty in that which she found, against all her current instincts about trusting men, genuinely disarming. "If you write those letters," he said carefully, "and if Larn is connected to the men who killed your husband, those letters could put you in danger." "I'm already in danger," she said. "The difference is that right now I'm just running from it. I'd rather face it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she did not look away. "All right," he said quietly. "Write your letters. Let me see them before they go out, and I'll route them through the marshal's office in San Antonio so there's a legal record." "You believe me," she said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out slightly rough. "I believe," he said carefully, "that the account you've given is consistent with what I know of Randolph Hayes's reputation, which reached this far south before you did. He was not an unknown quantity in certain circles." He paused. "I also believe that a woman who intends to lie does not typically volunteer incriminating details about her own flight from the scene. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was the careful, considered opinion of a man who weighed things honestly and stated what he found. And it was, somehow, the most meaningful thing anyone had said to her in years." She spent the following week writing. She sat at the small desk in her room at Martha Crane's boarding house, and she wrote detailed, careful letters to the marshal's office in Abilene, to the court in Kansas City, and to 2 journalists she had reason to believe were interested in the kind of corruption that Randolph and Victor Larn had been running. She described everything she had seen and heard and read on the night of Randolph's death, and she was precise and unflinching, and she did not embellish because the truth was already dark enough without decoration. Isaac reviewed each letter in the evenings, sitting across from her at the small table in the boarding house parlor that Martha Crane made available to them, with a discretion that suggested she had opinions, but was keeping them to herself. He suggested small changes here and there, places where the legal language needed tightening or where a claim needed more specific support, and Catherine incorporated the changes and argued about 2 of them and was right about one, which he acknowledged without difficulty. She noticed things about him during those evenings. The way he held his coffee cup. The way he read, completely still and very focused, his eyes moving steadily across the page. The way he occasionally pressed his thumb against the scar along his jaw when he was thinking hard about something, apparently without knowing he was doing it. She noticed, and she told herself that noticing was not the same as wanting, which was the kind of argument you make to yourself when you already know you've lost it. On the 9th day of her stay in Redemption, Deke Hollis came back. He did not come alone. He brought 2 men with him, and they rode into town in the early afternoon while Isaac was at the far end of the county on a matter that couldn't wait, and the only law in Redemption was Deputy Paul, who was 19 and good-hearted and not, in Catherine's assessment, equipped for what Hollis intended. She saw them ride in from the window of the general store, where she had been buying writing paper and ink. She recognized Hollis's way of sitting in the saddle, that particular posture of a man who believed he was owed whatever he was about to take. She went to Paul. She found him in front of the jailhouse and told him quietly what she had seen. Paul's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, landing finally on a determination that was admirable and terrifying in equal measure. "You should go to Martha's," he said. "Stay inside." "He's coming for me," Catherine said. "Going inside just means he knows exactly where I am." Paul looked at her, and then at the riders who were now coming down the main street of Redemption at a slow, deliberate walk. "Then stay behind me," he said. What happened next moved very fast. Hollis stopped his horse in front of the jailhouse and declared that he had a legal right to his bounty claim, that the sheriff of Redemption was obstructing federal justice, and that he intended to take Catherine Hayes into his custody. Paul told him, with a steadiness that Catherine found genuinely heroic, that he had no such right while she was under the protection of the Redemption Sheriff's office, and that he needed to leave. One of Hollis's men moved his horse to the left in a way that was meant to be casual and was not. The other moved right. It was a standard flanking, and Catherine recognized it even if Paul was too focused on Hollis to see it clearly. She did the only thing she could think of. She went back into the jailhouse, took the spare shotgun from the rack on the wall where she had watched Isaac lock and unlock it 3 times, broke it open to check it was loaded, snapped it shut, and walked back out onto the front step. "Mr. Hollis," she said, and her voice was very, very steady. "You should know that I am an excellent shot, and that I have been in considerably worse situations than this one recently, and I am not feeling particularly charitable toward men who believe they can own other people." She looked at him directly. "Leave, right now. The next time the sheriff sends you away, it won't be with your dignity intact." The standoff lasted about 45 seconds, which felt considerably longer. Then Hollis touched the brim of his hat with one finger, the way men do when they're leaving but want you to know they're filing it away, turned his horse, and rode back out of Redemption with his men behind him. Paul let out a breath so long it was almost a wheeze. "I should not have let you touch that shotgun," he said. "Probably not," Catherine agreed, setting it carefully back against the doorframe. When Isaac came back that evening and heard the account, he was quiet for a long time, and his expression did through something that Catherine could not quite read, but that made her want to take a step back and also, contrarily, a step forward. "You shouldn't have been in that position," he said finally. "That's on me. It worked out. It shouldn't have depended on you," he said, and the weight of that, the genuine regret in it, was something she sat with long after the conversation ended. He filed a report with the regional marshal's office that evening, and had an outstanding warrant confirmed for Hollis's arrest if he returned to the county. He did not make Catherine feel like a burden for the incident, and he did not make her feel like a hero, which she appreciated because she was neither. She had just been the person present who could see what needed to happen. She did not sleep well that night, not because of the incident with Hollis, but because of other things, quieter things, the kind of things that build up in the walls of you when you've been alone for a long time and you're not expecting company. A week passed, then 2. The letters she had sent began to generate responses. The first real result arrived from the marshal's office in San Antonio, a confirmation that Victor Larn had been under investigation for 18 months for the same series of land transaction frauds that Catherine had described, and that her account corroborated evidence they had gathered independently. More importantly, the marshal included information about the 2 men who had come to the Hayes house on the night of Randolph's death, men named Creel and Bauer, who were employed by Larn and who were now being actively sought in connection with the shooting. Isaac read this letter at the desk in his office with Catherine sitting across from him, and when he finished reading he set it down very carefully and looked at her. "This is your alibi," he said. "It's corroboration," she said carefully. "Is it enough?" "It won't be a simple matter," he said honestly. The charges against you are filed in 2 jurisdictions, and clearing them will require testimony and probably a hearing in Abilene. But this," he touched the letter, "this is the beginning of enough." She had been holding herself very controlled for a long time, and something in that sentence, the careful hope of it, the practical honesty of it, made something give way in her chest in a way she didn't quite manage to conceal. She looked away toward the window. The afternoon light was coming through the dusty glass at a long angle, touching everything gold. She heard him get up from his chair. She heard his boots on the wooden floor, and then he was standing beside her, and she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, close enough that she wasn't alone in the moment, and she understood, with the certainty of someone who had been paying careful attention, that this was simply how he was with things that mattered to him. He showed up. He stayed. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her, and whatever had been building between them over 3 weeks of careful evenings and honest conversations was present in the room in a way that neither of them was pretending wasn't there anymore. "Isaac," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something she had been carrying for a while. "Catherine," he said quietly, and the way he said her name made her feel for the first time in years like something precious. He did not kiss her, not then. He was too careful a man for that, too aware of the asymmetry of her situation, too respectful of the fact that she was standing in his county under the shadow of charges that hadn't cleared yet. But he put his hand over hers where it rested on the windowsill and kept it there, warm and still, and that was its own kind of statement. She turned her hand palm up under his, and that was hers. The next weeks were the strangest of Catherine's life, strange because they were good, because she was in a situation that should have been terrible, and it contained, alongside the fear and the uncertainty, something she hadn't expected to find here. She helped at the general store, trading her labor for meals to supplement what Isaac was paying for her board. Mrs. Alderman, who ran the store, was a brisk, fair-minded woman who didn't much care about wanted posters and cared a great deal about whether you showed up on time and worked honestly, which Catherine did. She learned the stock, the prices, the particular preferences of 400 people, and she discovered she was good at it, that she had a natural facility for remembering details and anticipating needs that made her genuinely useful. She was not, she was realizing, the woman who had grown tomatoes on a wraparound porch and told herself it was enough. Or rather, she was, but there was more of her than that, and this particular stretch of harsh and beautiful country was drawing it out. She and Isaac fell into a rhythm that neither of them named, because naming it felt premature, and also because the charges still hung over her head like weather. He came by the boarding house in the evenings. They walked sometimes, when the heat had broken and the sky turned the particular deep violet of high desert evenings. He told her things, not all at once but in pieces, the way people tell you things when they're deciding whether to trust you. He had come to redemption 8 years ago, in 1870, after the war and after what he described briefly, and without self-pity as a period of my life I wouldn't recommend. He had fought for the Union, which in West Texas in 1878 was still not universally appreciated. He had taken the sheriff's job because the town needed it, and because he had found, to his own slight surprise, that what he was best at was not violence but the particular hard work of keeping things fair. She told him things in return, about Kansas City, about her family, her parents who were both gone now, the younger brother she had lost to fever at 11, the way the world had contracted after that until she had married Randolph partly because he seemed to expand it again, and how wrong that had turned out to be. "You deserved better," he said one evening simply, not dramatically. "I made choices," she said. "People make choices with the information they have," he said. "That's not the same as deserving what happened." She looked at him in the last of the evening light, and the thing that she felt was not just attraction, though it was that, and not just gratitude, though it was that too. It was something more fundamental, the recognition of a person who saw clearly and thought honestly and showed up consistently, which in her experience was exceptionally rare. "You are a surprising man," she said, his mouth curved. "In what way?" "In every way I had prepared myself not to find here." The legal process ground forward the way legal processes always do, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paper. A letter from the Abilene Marshal's office confirmed that Victor Larn had been taken into custody in Kansas City in connection with the fraud investigation. His arrest generated further testimony, and Creel and Bauer, the men who had come to the Hayes house, were identified and named in an affidavit filed with the court. But the murder charge was the sticking point. It was filed in Kansas, and clearing it required a formal hearing, and that hearing required Catherine to appear in person in Abilene, which meant travel and exposure and a period of genuine uncertainty where the outcome was not guaranteed. Isaac told her all of this straight, sitting across from her at the parlor table with the documents laid out between them. "What are my actual chances?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Better than good if the affidavit from Larn's men holds, but I won't tell you it's certain because it isn't." "Will you come with me?" The question arrived before she had fully decided to ask it. She held still, waiting for his answer. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "I'll arrange coverage for the county. Paul has been doing good work. I'll come with you." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Catherine." He said her name in that way he had, quiet and direct. "I would like you to understand something clearly." "All right. I am coming with you because I intend for you to get through this," he said. "And then I intend to have a conversation with you that I think we both know is waiting. But I want you to be free and clear before we have it. I want it to be yours to choose without anything pressing on it." It was the most openly he had spoken about what was between them, and it was exactly like him, she thought, to say it in a way that was utterly honest and also utterly careful of her. "I know what I would choose," she said quietly, "for what it's worth." "It's worth a great deal," he said. "I just want to make sure it's yours to give when you give it." They left for Abilene on a Tuesday morning in late May, which in West Texas was already summer by temperature though not by calendar. Isaac had a proper wagon, not the hard-riding endurance test that Deke Hollis had forced on her, and they made reasonable time through the scrub country, stopping at established way stations and one night at a small ranch where the family knew Isaac and fed them extraordinarily well and asked no questions. The ranch family, the Garcias, had 4 children who ranged from about 6 to 14, and Catherine sat with them after dinner, while the eldest girl showed her a dress she was embroidering, and she felt something unfamiliar and lovely move through her chest that she thought was hope. Isaac appeared in the doorway of the ranch house, saw her sitting with the children, and the expression on his face was the most openly vulnerable she had seen him, a look that was there and then carefully put away, but which she had seen, and which she stored somewhere deep and quiet. Abilene in 1878 was a changed city from its cattle drive peak years of the early 1870s, more settled now, the wildness domesticated somewhat, with proper buildings and a functioning court system, and the particular atmosphere of a place that has survived its own most chaotic moment and is figuring out what to do next. Catherine found it familiar and strange simultaneously, the echoes of the Kansas landscape she had grown up in pressing through the distance she had put between herself and her old life. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd day after their arrival. The 2 days before it were the longest of Catherine's recent memory, longer even than the 3 days on horseback with Hollis, because this was waiting with hope in it, which is always harder than waiting without. Isaac arranged accommodations at a respectable hotel and spent those 2 days meeting with the regional marshal and the court-appointed attorney who had been assigned to Catherine's case, a thin, serious man named Alderton who, to Catherine's relief, seemed to actually be interested in the truth of what had happened. The night before the hearing, Catherine could not sleep. She sat by the window of her hotel room in the dark, watching the street below, the lamps throwing yellow circles in the dust, a cat walking the edge of a fence with extraordinary delicacy. There was a knock at her door around midnight. She opened it. Isaac stood in the hall, still dressed, a lamp in his hand. "Thought you might not be sleeping," he said. "I'm not." "Neither am I." He held up the lamp. "There's a sitting room at the end of the hall if you'd like company." She would like company. She would like specifically his company, which was something she had given up trying to rationalize away. They sat in the small sitting room at the end of the hall, the lamp on the table between them, and they talked, not about the hearing and not about the charges and not about the past. They talked about other things. The Garcia children, a book she had read and he had not, whether the town of Redemption would eventually get a telegraph, which Isaac thought inevitable and Catherine thought probably overdue. The way the night sky over West Texas had genuinely shocked her the first time she saw it properly. The density and extravagance of stars that simply did not exist at that scale in Kansas City. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, she had curled sideways in the chair with her feet tucked under her, and Isaac had moved to sit on the arm of the adjacent chair, and his hand had found its way to her hair, and he was smoothing it back from her face in a gesture so gentle and natural that neither of them remarked on it, just breathed it in like something necessary. "I'm not afraid," she said at some point, and was surprised to find it was true. Or, "I'm afraid, but it's different from before. Before I was afraid alone." "You're not alone," he said. She looked up at him. He looked back at her steadily, the way he always did. She reached up and put her hand over his where it rested against her hair. "Isaac," she said. "Catherine," he said. And then, finally, with the careful and long-considered certainty of two people who had been moving toward each other for weeks without rushing, he bent his head and kissed her. It was not a desperate kiss or a passionate outburst. It was the kiss of two people who had been genuinely honest with each other and were now being honest about this. And it was, in its quietness, the most completely felt thing Catherine had experienced in longer than she could calculate. When it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, and he kept his forehead against hers, and the lamp burned steadily between them. "We should sleep," he said eventually. "Probably," she agreed. But she sat with him for a while longer anyway, in the small sitting room at the end of the hall, the way you stay when you've found something and you're not quite ready to let go of it, even just to sleep. The hearing the next morning was formal and nerve-wracking and lasted 4 hours. Alderton presented Catherine's account, alongside the corroborating affidavits from Larn's arrested associates and the evidence from the marshal's investigation. The judge, a weathered man named Hartley who Catherine could not read at all, asked questions that were sharp and precise, and that she answered as clearly and directly as she could. The testimony of Creel, who had turned on Larn in exchange for reduced charges, was the turning point. He admitted under oath that he and Bauer had gone to the Hayes house on the night in question, that it was Bauer who had fired the shot that killed Randolph Hayes, and that Catherine had not been involved in any aspect of the conspiracy. He identified her explicitly as an uninvolved party, a bystander to her husband's crimes. It was not over immediately. Nothing legal is ever over immediately. But Judge Hartley suspended the charges pending final review, issued a declaration that the evidence strongly suggested Catherine's innocence in the matter of the murder, and recommended formal dismissal to the Kansas court. Alderton shook Catherine's hand. The marshal nodded at Isaac across the courtroom. Outside on the courthouse steps in the Abilene morning, Catherine stood in the heat and the noise of the street and breathed. Isaac came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. She appreciated that enormously. "It's not completely finished," she said. "No, but it's the shape of finished." She turned and looked at him, this man who had sent a bounty hunter away and kept his county and his word and his careful honesty through all of it, who had come 200 miles to stand beside her in a courthouse. "I want to go home," she said. He met her eyes. "To Redemption?" he asked quietly. "If that's possible," she said. "I would like to build something real there, something actually real for once." She paused. "If there's something to build." "There's something to build," he said, and the quietness in his voice was the absolute opposite of ambiguity. The ride back to Redemption took 4 days, and they were 4 days that Catherine would think about for the rest of her life. not because anything dramatic occurred, but because of what did occur, which was the unhurried, extraordinary pleasure of two people falling fully in love with no obstacles between them. They talked constantly and also sat in comfortable silence, which is, she had always believed, the real test. He told her more about his time before redemption, the war years, a period in New Mexico that he described with more honesty and less self-pity than she had expected, a broken engagement years ago to a woman who had wanted something he wasn't able to be then. She told him about the girl she'd been before Kansas City, before Randolph, a girl who had wanted to travel and read everything and know how things worked, a girl who had gotten smaller over time and was now, she thought, expanding again. He listened to that girl, the one she'd been, with the same full attention he gave to everything else, and she felt that girl come back a little more with every mile of West Texas they crossed together. They stopped on the second night at a place where the land opened up into a wide, shallow valley, and the creek they'd been following made a bend, and the evening light was something almost impossible, all rose and amber and deep lavender above the ridgeline. Isaac made a fire and they ate from the supplies they'd packed, and afterward Catherine sat close to him and he put his arm around her without ceremony, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the extraordinary sky above them. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Redemption, I mean, going somewhere." He considered the question genuinely. "When I first got there," he said, "for the first year or two. But then it stopped feeling like somewhere I was staying and started feeling like somewhere I was. You know the difference?" "I'm beginning to," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her hair, easy and natural like he'd been doing it for years. "Will you stay?" he asked, and it was a question with layers in it, all of which she understood. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." They arrived back in Redemption on a Saturday afternoon, and the town received them in the unceremonious way of a working frontier community, which is to say that Martha Crane noted their return with a sharp look that communicated she had drawn her own conclusions and was pleased by them, that Paul was visibly relieved that the sheriff was back, and that Mrs. Alderman at the general store immediately asked Catherine when she was coming back to work. Catherine came back to work on Monday. In the weeks that followed, while the formal dismissal of charges wound its slow way through the Kansas court system, life in Redemption moved forward in the way of lives that have found their shape. Catherine worked at the general store 5 days a week and spent the evenings at the jailhouse or walking the town with Isaac. And on Sundays, they rode out into the country because they both needed that, the open space of it, the reminder of what surrounded the small human settlement they were building their lives in. He was courting her properly, and she let him, because she had not had that before, had been rushed into marriage with Randolph without the slow pleasure of being genuinely sought by someone who meant it. Isaac was deliberate in his courtship the way he was deliberate in all things, attentive without being suffocating, present without being possessive. He brought her books from the San Antonio shipment that came through once a month. He told her things he had never told anyone, and she knew that not because he said it but because of the quality of his telling, the careful way he chose words for things that had been wordless. She told him things she had never told anyone. About the fear she had lived with in her marriage that she hadn't been able to name while she was in it, the constant low-grade uncertainty of being with someone you couldn't trust but couldn't prove was untrustworthy. About what it had felt like to be accused of things she hadn't done. About the particular loneliness of being invisible inside a life that looked fine from the outside. He received all of it without trying to fix it or minimize it, which was, she thought, its own form of love. The formal letter of dismissal arrived from the Kansas court in late June. It was a single page, official and dry, declaring the charges against Catherine Hayes to be dismissed in light of new evidence and exonerating her in the matter of the death of Randolph Hayes. Isaac handed it to her without preamble when she arrived at the office that morning. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set it on his desk very carefully. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She looked at him across his desk, this particular man who had looked at a woman in chains and seen a person rather than a case. "I told you in Abilene," she said, "that I wanted to build something real. You did. I meant it, I mean it." She held his gaze. "I want to build it with you." He came around the desk. He took her face in his hands with the extraordinary gentleness he brought to things that mattered to him, and he kissed her in the morning light of the jailhouse office in Redemption, Texas. And it was nothing like the careful midnight kiss in the Abilene hotel hallway, which had been a beginning. This was the thing itself, full and deep and sure, the kiss of two people who have found each other through a considerable amount of difficulty, and who intend to stay found. When it ended, he pressed his forehead to hers and she could feel him smiling, which was rare enough to be a gift. "Marry me," he said. It was not a question, and yet it was entirely one. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Obviously yes." His laugh was quiet and genuine and the best sound she had heard in a very long time. They were married in September of 1878, in the church in Redemption on a morning that was clear and still, with the last of the summer heat finally relenting to something that almost resembled a gentle autumn. Martha Crane, who had evidently been anticipating this development since approximately the first week of Catherine's stay at the boarding house, had been instrumental in the organization, and wore her best dress with the satisfaction of a woman whose predictions have been thoroughly vindicated. Mrs. Alderman closed the general store for the morning, which the town took as a significant declaration of endorsement. Deputy Paul, who had grown considerably in the months since he had stood down Deke Hollis with admirable determination, stood as a witness. The Garcia family came up from their ranch, which was a day's ride, because Isaac had written to them, and they had written back immediately saying of course they would come. Catherine wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the preceding weeks, with a high collar and small pearl buttons that she had found in a shipment at the general store, and bought immediately because they were exactly right. She had flowers in her hair that the youngest Garcia daughter had helped her arrange, small yellow wildflowers from the scrub country that smelled faintly of sun and dust. Isaac wore his good coat and his star, and looked at her when she walked into the church with an expression that made her feel, all over again, like something precious. The ceremony was simple, and it meant every word. She promised herself to him with a clarity she had not expected, not the nervous hope of her first marriage, but a considered and full-hearted choosing. And he promised himself to her in a voice that was low and steady, and that she felt in her chest like something finally settling into its right place. The celebration afterward was the entire town, essentially, the saloon closed and the street used instead, with tables set out and food from every household and the Garcia boys playing instruments with more enthusiasm than precision. Catherine danced with Isaac in the middle of Redemption's Main Street in the September afternoon, and she laughed, genuinely and freely, in a way she had not laughed in so long that the feeling of it was almost new. "How do you feel?" he asked her quietly, his hand at her waist. "Like myself," she said, "fully, I feel like myself." He smiled at her, and it was the open smile, the one she had been coaxing out of him for months, the one that changed his face completely. "Good," he said. "I've been looking forward to meeting her properly." Life as Catherine Donnelly had a texture that her life as Catherine Hayes had never achieved. It was not without difficulty, because nothing real ever is, but the difficulty was manageable and shared, and the fabric of it was woven through with a happiness that she had honestly not known was available to her. She continued at the general store through the autumn, but by early the following year she had begun, with Mrs. Alderman's blessing and a small loan from the Redemption Community Bank, to establish what became the town's first proper lending library. It was a small room behind the general store at first, 60 books she ordered from a publisher in San Antonio, and a sign she painted herself. But it grew steadily, fueled by donations and subscriptions, and the particular determination of a woman who believed that people in a place like Redemption deserved access to ideas as much as anyone else. Isaac was the library's most consistent patron, which she found endlessly amusing. "You check out more books than anyone else in the county," she told him one evening in their second year, the house they had built on the eastern edge of town already feeling like something permanent and real around them. "I have excellent taste," he said, not looking up from the page. "You have a wife who selects the inventory." He looked up then with the quiet smile that was still a gift every time. "That explains it." He was a different man than the one she had first seen across the chains on his desk, and also completely the same man. The quiet was still there, the steadiness, the absolute integrity that had made him send Deke Hollis away rather than take the money and look the other way. But there was warmth in him now that showed more, or perhaps she simply saw it more clearly, the warmth he had always had but held close, which was now given freely. Their son was born in the summer of 1880. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular and after everyone generally, and he arrived in the heat of July with what the midwife described as remarkable efficiency and a set of lungs that suggested he had opinions and intended to share them. Isaac, who Catherine had gently teased for months about being unnerved by the prospect of fatherhood, was completely undone by the child in a way that was one of the most beautiful things she had ever witnessed. He held Thomas with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and he looked at the small red face of his son with an expression that Catherine recognized. It was the same expression he had turned on her in the Garcia Ranch house doorway, that open and vulnerable look that he thought no one had seen except she always had. "He's real," Isaac said, somewhat wonderingly. "Entirely," Catherine agreed. She was tired and sore and happier than she had words for. And loud. "He has your determination," Isaac said, which she took as the compliment he intended it to be. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious child who wanted to know how everything worked and who followed his father around the town of Redemption with the earnest diligence of a small apprentice. Isaac was endlessly patient with his questions, explaining the workings of the law and the principles of fairness with the same quiet honesty he brought to everything, and Catherine watched her son learn not just facts, but a way of being in the world that was his father's gift to him. The library grew. By 1882, it had its own proper building, a single-room structure with large windows that Catherine had insisted on because books needed light, and more than 200 volumes, and a regular reading group that met on Wednesday evenings and had become one of the primary social institutions of Redemption. People came from outlying ranches and farms. A woman who could not read asked Catherine quietly one afternoon if she could be taught, and Catherine taught her, and then taught 3 others. And by the following year there was a proper literacy class running on Thursday mornings that Catherine ran with the help of the preacher's wife, and a retired schoolteacher who had arrived in town looking for something useful to do. The injustice of what had happened to her, the way the law had turned her into a criminal for the crimes of a man she hadn't known was a criminal, was something Catherine thought about often. Not with bitterness, though she had earned bitterness, but with a clear-eyed recognition that the legal system of 1878 Texas was not designed with women's interests in mind, and that being on the wrong side of it had given her a particular understanding of what it cost when things weren't fair. She talked about it with Isaac in the evenings, in the house on the eastern edge of Redemption, and he listened and thought and agreed with more of it than she expected, given that he was the instrument of a law that was often imperfect. "A law is only as good as the people applying it," he said once. "I know that. I try to apply it with as much honesty and as much consideration as I can. But the law itself has gaps that shouldn't exist. Women should be able to testify more fully on their own behalf," she said. "The rules about what constitutes admissible testimony from a wife about her husband's activities are absurd." "They are absurd," he agreed, without qualification. "I've seen those rules let guilty men walk and convict innocent women." It was one of the things she loved most about him, that he never defended the system simply because he operated within it, that he was able to hold both things simultaneously, the necessity of the work and the clear sight of its flaws. In 1883, Deke Hollis was arrested in San Antonio on the outstanding warrant from the Bexar County Court, the one Isaac had mentioned on the day he sent him away from redemption. Catherine heard about it through the marshal's network that Isaac kept up with, and the satisfaction she felt was quiet and complete. She was not a vengeful person, but she believed in accountability, and Hollis had operated for years on the belief that he could treat people as property and never answer for it, and answering for things mattered. Their daughter was born in 1884, in the early autumn, when the land around Redemption had taken on its most beautiful colors, the deep gold and rust and green that came with the end of the summer heat. They named her Rose, and she arrived in the world with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn expression, and she was adored by Thomas, age 4, with an intensity that was occasionally alarming and always touching. Catherine held her daughter in the afternoon light of their bedroom and thought about where she had been 6 years ago, chained to a bounty hunter's horse in the desert, accused of crimes she hadn't committed, alone and running. She thought about the moment the chains had fallen from her wrists, and a man with quiet dark eyes had pushed a cup of water across a desk. She thought about the beginning of that, and the distance between then and now, and she found that the distance was not a loss but an accumulation. Everything that had happened between there and here, every hard and frightening and beautiful thing, was something she had lived fully, and none of it was wasted. Isaac came to sit beside her on the bed. He looked at Rose with the same wonder he'd had at Thomas, undiminished by familiarity, because wonder was not something he used up. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Catherine said. "She just got here. Give her a moment." He laughed, and she felt it against her shoulder where his arm was around her, and she leaned into him, and their daughter blinked up at both of them with the ancient and disorienting wisdom of the newly arrived. The town of Redemption grew over the following years in the way frontier towns grew when they were in good hands, steadily, and with a kind of organic rootedness. New families arriving, new buildings going up, a school that the library's success had helped push into existence, a doctor who came in 1885 and stayed, a second church for the Catholic families who had been making a long ride every Sunday. Isaac was re-elected as sheriff 3 consecutive times without significant opposition, which in a town of strong opinions and independent people was not nothing. He was a fair man in a context where fairness was not always convenient, and people knew it, and that kind of reputation, built slowly and maintained honestly, is the most durable thing there is. Catherine's library became something she was quietly and thoroughly proud of, not just the collection but what it had grown into, a place where people came to learn and think and meet and argue about ideas, which she believed was exactly what a library should be. The literacy class had by 1886 taught more than 40 adults to read, and several of those had gone on to teach others, a chain of learning that spread outward from the single room behind the general store where it had started. She wrote, too, articles for the San Antonio newspaper about frontier life and about education, and occasionally about the gaps in the legal protections available to women in Texas, which generated letters both supportive and hostile, and which she read with equal interest because she believed in understanding opposition as clearly as agreement. Isaac read everything she wrote and gave her his honest opinion, which was occasionally that she was right, and occasionally that she had overstated a point, and occasionally that she had buried the most important thing too deep in the argument and needed to move it forward. She found his editorial instincts irritatingly good. "How do you know so much about rhetorical structure?" she asked him once, finding him more useful than she'd expected on the architecture of a particular piece. "I've been reading your library for 5 years," he said. Thomas, at 8, was already showing an aptitude for numbers that neither parent fully shared, and that the school teacher, Mrs. Harrow, said was exceptional. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with columns of numbers that he found as natural as language, and Isaac sat with him sometimes not to help, but just to be present, the way he had been present for Catherine in the hard moments, the simple gift of his company. Rose, at 4, was a person of very decided opinions who had identified the library as her personal domain and patrolled its shelves with a proprietary air that the Wednesday reading group had begun to find charming. She could not yet read, but she had memorized the spines of 30 books and knew exactly where each one belonged, and she informed adults who put books back in the wrong place with a directness that was pure Catherine. In 1887, on a quiet Tuesday evening in October, Catherine sat with Isaac on the porch of their house and watched the stars come out over the Texas sky. The children were asleep. The town below them was quiet. A coyote called somewhere in the distance and another answered, the sound carrying clean through the dry air. "Do you remember," she said, "the first evening I walked you back from the creek bed, after the water rights dispute? I remember. I watched you work before you saw me," she said, "and I thought, this is a man who understands what fairness costs." He was quiet for a moment. "What made you think that?" "Because you made a decision that nobody could be entirely happy with, and you did it anyway because it was right. Men who care more about being liked than being fair don't do that." She looked at the stars. "It was the first thing that made me feel safe in a very long time." He reached over and took her hand in the dark, his thumb moving in that slow, steady way across her knuckles. "I was trying not to notice you," he said. She laughed, quiet and surprised. "Were you?" Emphatically. "You were a woman under my protection in a legally complicated situation, and I was attempting to behave with appropriate professional distance." "How long did that last?" "Until about the third evening," he admitted, with a rueful quality in his voice that she loved. "When you argued with my revision of the second letter to the marshal's office and you were correct." "I knew I was correct." "That was abundantly clear," he said. "It was also, unreasonably, the moment at which appropriate professional distance became much more difficult to maintain." She turned to look at him in the starlight, and he was already looking at her, and it was the same as it had always been between them, this clarity, this honest seeing. "We did all right," she said, not as a boast but as a true assessment. "More than all right," he said. "Consider the evidence." The evidence was the house behind them, warm and lit, with 2 children asleep in their beds. The evidence was the town down the hill, where a library stood because she had believed in the importance of books in a place that had none. The evidence was 9 years of a life built honestly and together, of conversations that went deep and laughter that came easy, and the ordinary daily miracle of being genuinely known by another person, and choosing each other anyway, every day, choosing each other again. The evidence was that she had arrived in redemption in chains, and she had put down roots that went all the way to bedrock. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the October night with the stars extravagant above them and the coyotes calling in the dark, and the whole wide, indifferent beauty of West Texas spread out before them. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. In the spring of 1889, when Thomas was 9 and Rose was 5, a letter arrived from the Kansas court that Catherine had almost forgotten about. A final administrative confirmation that all records pertaining to the original charges against Catherine Hayes had been formally expunged, the record cleared, the matter closed in every legal sense. She read the letter and handed it to Isaac without comment. He read it and handed it back. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way he had taught her to think about things, or rather the way being with him had reminded her that she already knew how. "Free," she said. "I feel free. I know the charges were dismissed years ago, but this is different. This is the last door closing on all of it." He nodded. "Then it's done." "It's done," she agreed. Later that evening, with the children at the table and the lamp burning and the dinner that Isaac had started before she got home from the library simmering on the stove, Catherine stood in the doorway of her kitchen and looked at her family. Thomas was arguing with Rose about something involving a picture book, patiently and with entirely too much 8-year-old condescension. Isaac was at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, stirring something and listening to the argument with the small private smile of a man who finds his children delightful even when they are being ridiculous. Rose noticed Catherine in the doorway and announced her arrival in the way of small people who are very pleased when their parents appear. "Mama, Thomas said the rabbit in this book is wrong because rabbits don't talk, and I said it's a story and stories can have talking rabbits, but Thomas says that's not logical." "Thomas is right that it's not logical," Catherine said, coming to kiss the top of Rose's head. "You're right that it doesn't matter." Both children appeared to find this simultaneously satisfying and maddening, which was exactly right. Isaac turned from the stove and met her eyes, and the expression on his face was the full and simple thing it always was when he looked at her, not performed, not embellished, just real and clear and completely certain. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him briefly and warmly, the way you kiss someone when you are at home with them. "Letter came today," she said against his cheek. "The court in Kansas, it's officially done, everything cleared." He pulled back to look at her. "Everything," she said. He kissed her again properly, and she felt his arms come around her and the warmth of the kitchen and the noise of the children and the smell of dinner. And she thought, this is the real thing. This is what real looks like. And she held it close and did not take a single moment of it for granted. Redemption. Texas in 1889 was a different place from the small frontier town that had received a chained woman and sent a bounty hunter away 11 years before. It had grown into something with permanence and character, a place that had found its own shape. The library on the main street had a proper sign above the door that Thomas had helped his mother paint. The school was full. The Garcia family still came to town once a month and always stopped by for dinner. Isaac Donnelly was still the sheriff of Redemption County, still carrying that star with the same quiet honesty he had always brought to it, still applying the law with the understanding that a law is only as good as the people applying it, and that being one of those people was a responsibility he took seriously every day. Catherine Donnelly was still the most opinionated person on the Redemption Town Council, where she had served since 1885. Still writing articles for the San Antonio paper that generated interesting mail, still running the library that had become the heart of the town in a way she had always hoped for and never taken for granted. They were not perfect people, and they did not have a perfect life. They argued, sometimes seriously, about things that mattered and occasionally about things that didn't. And they had learned over a decade how to argue honestly and resolve things fully and come back to each other without the distance that unresolved things leave. There had been hard years and frightening moments. A drought in 1886 that hit the ranching families hard and rippled through the whole town. An illness of Thomas's at 7 that had terrified them both and resolved safely. The ordinary accumulations of grief that a life in a place accumulates over time. But the foundations were true, and what is built on true foundations holds. On the evening of their 11th wedding anniversary, September of 1889, they rode out of town together as they had so many times over the years, into the open country, just the two of them, leaving the children with Martha Crane, who was now 70 and still sharp, and still very pleased with how things had turned out. They rode to the place where the land opened into the wide shallow valley, where the creek made its bend, where they had sat once on their way back from Abilene with everything still uncertain and everything already inevitable. The evening light was doing what it always did in West Texas, making something extraordinary of ordinary air, turning the ridgelines rust and gold. They stopped their horses and sat in the early evening quiet. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Catherine said. "Tell me." "The day you unlocked those chains," she said. "It was such a small thing in terms of what you actually did, just a key and a lock, but it was the first time in a very long time that someone did something for me that was simply right, without an angle, without a cost, just right. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ridgeline. "It wasn't small," he said. "It was the thing I was most afraid of not doing." She looked at him. "I saw you standing there," he said, "and I saw someone who was being handled like property, and I thought, if I do nothing about this right now, I am complicit in it, and I am not able to be that." He paused. "I did not anticipate everything that would follow from that decision." "Are you glad?" she asked, the way she occasionally did, because the answer was always the same and she never got tired of hearing it. He turned from the ridgeline and looked at her, and it was the full, open look, the one that had started as rare and had become frequent over 11 years, the one that still arrived each time like something new. "Every single day," he said, without qualification. "Every single day of my life." She reached across the distance between their horses, and he met her hand with his, and they held on in the fading light over the valley, with the creek running below them and the wide Texas sky above them. And the stars, all those extraordinary stars, beginning to appear one by one in the deepening dark. And the life they had built together was all around them, in every direction, extending forward into all the unknown and promising years still ahead. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.